31 people had walked through Nora Callahan's office door in 7 years. Assistants, contractors, specialists, well-meaning strangers with clipboards and softer voices than the situation required. Not one of them lasted more than a week. Then a single father with a chalk line and a 7-year-old daughter who asked too many questions walked into the building. Not because he thought he could change her, but because he had a job to finish and a mortgage that didn't care about her reputation. What happened next will stay with you long after the story ends. If you've ever held a door open for someone who didn't ask for it, tap like and drop your city below. Now, let's begin. The building was the first thing Dean Marsh noticed about Nora Callahan, and the building was the most honest thing about her. It stood on the corner of a wet Portland street in late November, 10 stories of glass and reclaimed timber framing, a structure that had been designed to look both forward-thinking and completely in control of itself. The kind of building that costs money to make look effortless. From the outside, it was flawless. From Dean's trained eye, the eye of a man who spent his working life reading buildings the way other people read faces, it was full of quiet contradictions. The lobby had a ramp, yes, but the ramp was angled 2 degrees steeper than code permitted, which made it technically legal and practically uncomfortable. The door handles in the elevator bank were positioned at a height that was correct on paper and awkward in practice. The accessible restroom on the 3rd floor had a turning radius that was 18 inches too narrow for a standard manual chair. Someone had tried, and someone had gotten it almost right, which was often more revealing than failing entirely. Dean stood at the front entrance with his satchel over one shoulder and his audit checklist on a clipboard and the address confirmation on his phone, and he looked at the building the way he always looked at a new site, as a problem the architect thought they'd already solved. He wasn't there for Nora Callahan specifically. He was there because Callahan Meridian's legal team had retained his firm to conduct a full ADA compliance audit before a pending renovation. The email had been perfunctory. He'd been given access times, a list of floors, a contact name. The contact name was not Nora Callahan. It was an office manager named Patricia Wren, who had met him at the front desk with a folder of floor plans and a look that carried a specific professional tension, the look of someone who had been asked to facilitate something the person above them had not enthusiastically agreed to. "Miss Callahan wanted me to let you know," Patricia had said, choosing her words with the care of someone navigating a minefield in heels, that the audit can proceed as scheduled, but that she will not be available for walkthroughs. Dean had nodded and taken the folder and started with the ground floor. He had been in the building for 40 minutes when Nora Callahan appeared. He knew it was her before she said a word. Not because he recognized her from the company's press materials, though he had looked them up before the job, but because of how the room changed when she came through the east corridor. Not because people stopped working. They kept working. But their working acquired a slight additional quality of deliberateness, the particular body language of people who were performing normalcy for an audience they respected and feared in equal measure. She moved with the economy of someone who had been doing this for years and had long since stopped thinking about the mechanics of it. The chair was a rigid manual, custom-fitted navy blue, and she pushed it with the unhurried precision of someone who understood that the fastest way to get somewhere was not to rush, but to be efficient in each small movement. Her hair was dark and cut close to her jaw. She wore a charcoal blazer over a gray shirt, and her expression when she found Dean crouched near the south wall, measuring the baseboard clearance, was the particular expression of someone discovering a thing in their space that they had not invited. She didn't say anything for a moment. Dean looked up. He didn't stand immediately, which he would later understand had been by accident. The correct thing to do. He was mid-measurement, and he finished it, wrote the number in his notes, then straightened. "Dean Marsh," he said. "Accessibility audit. I know who you are." Her voice was measured. Precise, not unkind, but carrying the tone of someone who had made a career of not wasting words. "What I wasn't told was why you're measuring the baseboard. The base molding creates a protrusion at floor level," he said. "Nothing that affects code compliance, but it would catch the front casters of a power chair on a turning approach from the corridor. Minor correction in the renovation scope would solve it." She looked at the wall. Then she looked at him. What she made of the answer was not readable, but it was not dismissive. "That wasn't in the original renovation brief," she said. It should be, he said. A pause. She moved to look at the wall herself, angling the chair to view the junction of molding and floor at the angle he'd been measuring from. She looked for several seconds. Then she moved on without a word. He watched her go, then went back to his checklist. She appeared twice more that first morning. Once at the elevator bank, where she watched him measure the button heights without comment. Once near the rear exit, where she came through the doors at speed and stopped 2 feet from him with the ease of someone who had been navigating spaces at speed for years and knew exactly how much room they needed. That door, she said without preamble, indicating the one she'd just come through. It's heavy, he agreed. Pressure calibration on the closer is set for a standing pull. In a chair, you're working against it one-handed if your other hand is occupied. The contractor said it was within spec. It is. Within spec and within comfortable use aren't the same measurement. She looked at the door. Then she looked at him, and there was something in the look that was different from the look she'd given him near the baseboard. Less evaluation, more something else that he didn't have a name for yet. How long will the audit take, she asked. 3 days for documentation, he said, depending on the access I get to the upper floors. She didn't say anything about the upper floors. She turned and went back through the door, and it swung shut behind her with the heavy, resistant arc of a door calibrated for a body that was not hers. Dean noted the door pressure in his report. Then he moved on to the stairwell. That was how it began. The end of the first day, Dean sat in his truck in the parking garage and reviewed his notes under the dome light. He had 41 items, and it was only day 1. Most of them were minor. Several were not. All of them were the product of a building that had been designed by someone who understood accessibility theoretically, but not lived in, which was the most common gap he encountered in his work, and also the hardest to explain to the people who had designed the buildings without meaning to get it wrong. He had worked in 12 cities. He had audited hospitals and schools and municipal buildings and corporate headquarters. He had found in every one of them the same fundamental pattern. A designer's best understanding of what a space needed had stopped at the edge of their own experience. The ramp that was too steep by 2 degrees. The restroom that was 18 inches too narrow. The door that required a standing pull. He had learned, over years of this, not to be angry about it. The buildings weren't mean. They were built by people who had imagined a need they hadn't lived. The Callahan Meridian building was different in one specific way. The person who had lived the need was the same person who had designed the building before she lived it. And she had spent 7 years moving through the space she'd gotten wrong. 7 years finding the threshold before she'd thought to fix it. 7 years of the door that was too heavy. He thought about that on the drive home. He thought about it while Clover explained the water cycle project she was doing for school, which involved a diagram she was drawing on graph paper and which required more blue marker than they had, and could they go to the art store this weekend? He said yes. He made dinner. He put Clover to bed with the lamp on low, because she still preferred it that way. A habit left over from the first year after Iris. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his audit notebook to the first page of that day's notes, and added, at the bottom, in small letters that were for himself and not the report, she designed it before she knew. She's been correcting it from inside ever since. He wasn't sure why he wrote it. He wrote it because it was true, and because he had learned over years of working alone that the things worth keeping were the ones he wrote down before he lost them. He closed the notebook and went to bed. The second morning, Nora did not appear until mid-afternoon. Patricia told Dean, with the careful neutrality of someone navigating a complicated interpersonal dynamic, that Ms. Callahan had a full morning of calls and was not expected on the lower floors before 2. Dean thanked her and went to work on the 3rd and 4th floors, the conference rooms, the corridors, the supply rooms whose door widths were technically compliant and practically difficult, the narrow hallway near the stairs that had always been a pinch point and had been repainted recently without anyone addressing the pinch. When Nora appeared at 2:15, she came off the elevator and went directly to the main conference room, where a presentation was running. Through the glass wall, Dean could see her at the head of the table, a room full of people with laptops, and the particular attentiveness of a team mid-briefing. She spoke and people wrote things down. She asked a question and someone pulled up a different screen. The meeting had the rhythm of a room that knew how to work, because the person running it had made the work clear. He watched for 2 minutes, not long enough to be curious, just long enough to understand something about her he hadn't had the context for yet. The authority was not performed. It was simply present, the way the structure of a well-built building was present. You only noticed it because removing it would leave something that could not stand on its own. He went back to measuring door swings. At 4:30, she found him in the north stairwell exit, where he was checking the hardware on the crash bar against current ADA code. She came through the door and held it for him, which was a habit, an ordinary courtesy, the kind of thing people did automatically. Then she stopped. He looked at her. She was looking at her own hand on the door, the position of it, the way she'd held the door, not for herself, but for him, from the chair, with the particular upper body extension that made it possible. He said nothing. She let the door close and moved past him into the stairwell access corridor. He said, "The crash bar hardware is fine. The threshold between the stairwell and this corridor has a slight height variation, not enough to cause a problem at slow speed." She said, "At speed." He said it would register. She said, "I know." She said it without explanation and moved on. He was beginning to understand that she had a precise and comprehensive map of every difficulty in this building. She had not needed him to find most of them. She had been living them for 7 years. What he was giving her was something different. The language for what she already knew, and the documentation that said it was not acceptable and could be corrected, which was not the same as knowing it and never speaking it. That distinction mattered. He thought about it on the drive home again, and thought about it still when he woke up at 6 the next morning and thought, a person can carry the knowledge of what's wrong for years without believing it's worth naming. Not with a dramatic encounter. Not with a confrontation or a moment of crisis. It began the way most real things began, with proximity and work. And two people who had both learned to read the world carefully noticing, without quite deciding to, that the other one was doing the same thing. Nora Callahan had been running Callahan Meridian for 11 years. She had taken over from her father at 31 when he had what the press had called a health event, which was the phrase the company's communications team had selected to avoid saying that Bryn Callahan had sat down in a board meeting and not gotten up again on his own. He had spent 8 months in rehabilitation and had, by all accounts, recovered substantially, but not to the degree that made returning to a CEO role advisable. Nora had been his deputy. She had stepped in with the composed efficiency of someone who had been preparing for the role her entire professional life, because she had been. She was 32 when she stopped being able to walk. The details were not widely publicized because Nora Callahan did not publicize details. What was known was the broad shape of it. A car accident on a wet highway outside Bend. 3 days after Christmas. A collision that had been no one's particular fault and everyone's particular tragedy. She had been the only serious casualty. She had spent 6 weeks in the hospital and 11 months in a rehabilitation program, and had returned to her desk at Callahan Meridian on a Thursday morning 7 years ago, without a press release or an announcement of any kind. She had simply come back. She had also, in the 7 years since, made it comprehensively clear that she required nothing from anyone that she had not specifically requested. She had not requested much. She had turned down the office renovation her board had proposed, the personal aid they had offered 3 separate times, the dedicated parking arrangement that would have required 2 employees to be relocated. She had accepted a chair with an adjustable height when the conference room tables were replaced, which she had requested herself in a memo that had cited ergonomic productivity data rather than personal need. She was the kind of woman who had turned self-sufficiency into a principle so thoroughly held that it had the quality of something structural. Not performed, not brittle, just fully load-bearing. Before the accident, she had been the same, according to the people who had known her then and still worked at Callahan Meridian now. Patricia had been with the company for 14 years, and she told Dean, in the careful fragments she offered on the 3 occasions he thought to ask, that Nora had always been this way. That the refusal was not a product of the accident, but a characteristic the accident had reinforced and focused. That there had been a version of Nora before who had been occasionally warmer in small moments, who had sometimes stopped by a desk to ask about a colleague's family or illness, who had laughed at meetings when something was actually funny rather than simply noting it. The warmth was still there, Patricia said. It had just recalibrated to a different expression, a more compressed one. Dean had heard this and thought about the buildings he had worked in, where a renovation had closed off a room. The room was still there. The space still existed. You could hear the sound differently in the corridor that ran past it, a slight change in the acoustics. A wall that resonated at a different frequency than the surrounding structure. The room was closed, not gone. He had learned not to say this to people when they were talking about other people. He had learned to keep his architectural thinking about human beings to himself, because most people found it strange. He kept it. He found it useful. He had known from the first day of the audit that Nora Callahan was not difficult because she was cruel. She was not. She was precise, and she was demanding, and she had the specific intolerance for inefficiency of someone who had built a company from the inside and knew every corner of it. But she was not cruel. She had looked at the baseboard, and looked at his notes, and looked at him, and in that sequence of looking she had been a person examining information rather than a person defending territory. The people who had come before him, the assistants and contractors and specialists who had lasted days and weeks, and sometimes not even hours, had not understood that. They had taken her precision for hostility and her refusal for contempt, and they had tried to manage both, and they had failed. Because management was the wrong tool for a person who was not performing a character, but simply being the one she had. He had not tried to manage her. He had done his job. He had noted the baseboard, and the door pressure, and the threshold, and the 32 items, and the tapping foot, and the drawings on the windowsill, and he had shown up each time with the same thoroughness and the same willingness to say the true thing without exclamation, and he had waited for the building to tell him what it needed. Buildings told the truth. He had believed this since the first job he had done, a municipal library in a small city in southern Oregon, where he had found 11 items in 2 days and had delivered the report, and the client had said, "Are you sure?" And he had said, "Yes, the building is sure. I'm just transcribing." Nora Callahan's building was sure. He had just been transcribing. Dean had learned from Patricia that 6 people had attempted the audit before him. Not one of them had completed the work. The first 2 had been sent by the building's original architect and had submitted reports that were polite and comprehensive and addressed nothing that would require a structural commitment from the facilities committee. The third had been retained by Nora's legal team and had lasted a day and a half before the relationship had ended in a terse email exchange about the scope of professional authority. The fourth had been a former colleague of the building's contractor who had turned up without being told about the first 3 and had submitted a report that duplicated 2 of the previous findings and missed everything else. The 5th and 6th had come from the same firm, which was the firm Dean's company had been recommended through, and both had declined to return after the first site visit. He had read all 4 completed reports before he arrived. He had noted what they found and what they hadn't found, and he had formed a picture of what a person who was paying attention would see when they walked into the building. He had been right. There were 32 things. The second day of the audit, he was on the 6th floor measuring door clearances in the north corridor when Nora came off the elevator moving fast, which was her default setting. She came around the corner and had to check her pace abruptly because Dean was crouched in the middle of the corridor door swing with the tape extended across the threshold. He looked up. She looked at him. Neither of them apologized. "The clearance on that one is fine," she said. "It's the frame depth," he said. "Industry standard clearance, but the door frame itself projects into the swing arc. When the door is fully open, the effective clearance narrows by 3 inches. For a power chair user in a hurry," he paused, "you'd catch the armrest." She was quiet for a moment. "You're going to add this to the list," she said. "It's already on the list," he said. She moved past him. 3 steps down the corridor, she said. Without turning, "How many items are on the list?" 47 so far. She stopped. "Then, how many of them are things no one has noticed in 11 years of operation?" 32. He heard her exhale. A single, controlled breath. "I designed this building," she said. He didn't say anything. "I was 29, she said. "Before I did the spec review myself. I went through every accessibility requirement personally." "I know," Dean said. "I read the original brief. Then why are there 32 things I missed?" He stood up and looked down the corridor at her. Her back was still turned. The line of her shoulders was the particular line of someone who had asked a question they were not certain they wanted answered. Because, he said carefully, you were writing from the spec. You weren't writing from inside it. A long pause. Then she moved on. He went back to the doorframe. That conversation was the first one that mattered, and it mattered because of what was underneath it. Not the building, not the 32 line items. The thing underneath was the quiet, specific grief of a woman who had done everything right from the outside and still found the building she'd designed was wrong in ways she hadn't been able to see from where she'd been standing when she designed it. Dean knew something about that kind of grief. He didn't say so. Not then. But he filed it in the way he filed everything important. The way you filed the things you were going to need to understand later. The third day of the audit, he finished the second floor in the morning and spent the afternoon working through the basement level, the service areas, the loading dock access, the emergency exit routes. Patricia brought him coffee at 2 and said, with the particular calibration of someone testing the waters, that Miss Callahan had asked whether his report would be available by end of week. He said it would. Patricia hesitated. Then she said, she's read every ATA audit this building has ever had. She keeps them in a folder in her personal filing system. Has since the accident. She reads them and files the corrective recommendations. And then nothing ever gets corrected. Because the recommendations go to the facilities committee, and the facilities committee has 3 members, and 2 of them are the same 2 people who have been on every facilities committee. 9 years, and they defer the recommendations. He looked at her. Patricia said, I'm not supposed to know that, and I know it. He said, why hasn't she pushed harder on the corrections? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because asking them to change the building is asking them to acknowledge what the building required. And she has spent 7 years making very sure that no one in this building thinks about what it requires. Because she decided a long time ago that what it required was her problem and not theirs. He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. He thought about the particular kind of self-sufficiency that had been so thoroughly internalized it had become indistinguishable from pride. Not fragile pride. Not the pride that broke under pressure. The deep structural kind, load-bearing. The kind that had been holding things up for so long that the person inside it had forgotten the difference between standing on their own and standing inside a structure that was doing the work. He had seen that in buildings, too. The column that had been carrying a load for decades and looked fine. That looked permanent and purposeful and as though it belonged exactly where it was, until you removed the surface material and found the original structure underneath had cracked at the base and had been holding by friction and habit, rather than genuine integrity. That wasn't a failure of the column. That was deferred maintenance. On the 4th visit, which was not technically part of the audit scope, but was a follow-up meeting Patricia had scheduled for questions about the renovation brief, Nora was at her desk when Dean arrived, and she was on a call that was clearly difficult. He could tell from 20 feet away through the glass office wall the particular quality of her stillness when something was requiring her to manage emotion with efficiency. The way her pen moved in small controlled circles on the notepad that was not writing anything. He waited in the reception area. The call ended. She came to the door and said, "Come in," and he came in. He sat across from her. He said nothing about the call. She said nothing about it either. She said, "There's a section of the East Corridor that I want you to look at before you finalize the report." She pulled up a floor plan. She pointed. This junction where the old building connects to the new construction. The floors don't match level. He leaned forward to look. He said, "I saw it. It's a 3/4 inch variation. I've got it flagged." She said, "The transition strip the contractor installed covers it visually." He said, "But not functionally. At speed, in wet weather, if the strip has any give." She said, "Yes." He said, "I've recommended a full reflooring of that 15-foot section to bring them to the same datum." She said, "The contractor said it was unnecessary." He said, "The contractor is wrong." A pause. She said, "I know. I've known it for 4 years." He looked at her. She was looking at the floor plan. Her right hand was resting on the desk and her right foot, which he noticed because he was someone who noticed structural details and the human body had its own structural logic that he had learned to read over years. Her right foot was pressing against the floor tile in a small rhythmic motion. Pressing and releasing, pressing and releasing. Tapping, not agitation. Something else. Something almost mechanical, like a person testing whether a surface had give. She didn't appear to know she was doing it. He looked at the floor plan. He said, "I'll include specific language in the report that makes the contractor's position indefensible. The documentation will give your facilities committee no cover to defer it again." She looked up at him. The particular quality of that look was one he was starting to recognize, surprise that had been quickly covered by composure. The look of someone who had expected to have to justify the recommendation again and hadn't had to. She said, "Good." They worked through the rest of the brief. He left at 4. He sat in his truck in the parking garage again and opened his notebook and wrote, in the small letters at the bottom of the page, a single observation: right foot. Pressing against the floor. She didn't know. He looked at it. Then he started the truck and drove home. The weeks accumulated. The audit concluded. The report was filed. And then the calls from Nora continued, professionally framed, about renovation scope and design consultants and east entrance approaches, and Dean accepted each one and went back to the building and worked on the problems she put in front of him with the same thoroughness he brought to every job. But he was also watching other things. He was watching the way she moved through the building now with the audit findings in the contractor's hands. She moved differently in the spaces that had been corrected, not dramatically, not with any visible acknowledgement, but with the slightly different quality of a person moving through a space that no longer required the same calibrated avoidance. A fraction more ease at the elevator bank. A slightly different approach to the third-floor restroom corridor, which was still not corrected, but was scheduled for month 2. And he was watching the foot. The small tapping motion, pressing against the floor at thresholds and changes in surface. She never mentioned it. She may not have been aware of it. He wrote it down each time and said nothing. He was not a medical professional. He was a man who read buildings and who had learned over years that the small involuntary motions of a body in a space told you things the body was not ready to say out loud. He noted it and waited and said nothing and kept working. His daughter Clover had been 4 when Iris died. He had told her in a way that was honest and incomplete. The way you told children things when the full truth was too large, that Mama had gotten very sick very fast and the doctors couldn't fix it and she was gone. Clover had been quiet for a long time and then had asked if Mama had taken her yellow sweater with her, and he had said, "Yes, sweetheart, she took the yellow sweater," which was not true and was the right answer. He had not dated anyone since. He had not, for a long time, done much of anything except work and cook dinner and read to Clover at night and go to bed in a house that still smelled, very faintly like Iris's shampoo for the first year, and then just smelled like a house. He had built his firm slowly, contract by contract, in the 4 years since. He had a reputation for being thorough, and for being quiet and for finding. In every building he audited, the exact place where the good intention had stopped 1 degree short of actual use. He did not think of himself as a person who changed things. He thought of himself as a person who saw clearly. On the 3rd day of the audit, he was in the building's original lobby entrance. The old part. The section that predated the renovation, where the marble threshold of the front doors had a half-inch rise that the newer sections didn't. The kind of detail that accumulated in buildings over time, a scar from a previous era that had never been corrected because it was easy to overlook if you were looking at the building instead of moving through it. He crouched down with his chalk and marked the threshold edge. The way he marked things, he was flagging for the renovation notes, a small clean horizontal line at the top of the rise, to show the contractor where to feather the transition. He heard the elevator behind him, heard the familiar sound of Nora's chair on the lobby tile, heard her come to a stop somewhere behind him. "What are you marking?" she asked. "Threshold. Half-inch rise. It's minor, but it creates a catch point at speed," he said without looking up. The chalk line shows the angle of correction. A pause. "That threshold has been there since 1978. "I know," he said. "That's why it's still there." He finished the mark and stood and turned. She was closer than he'd expected, stopped just inside the elevator bank, looking at the chalk line on the floor with an expression he had not seen from her yet. Not sharp, not measured. Something quieter and older, the expression of someone looking at a thing that has been in their way for a long time and has been too small to name. "I've hit that," she said, more quietly than was typical for her. He didn't say "I know," though he had suspected as much the moment he measured it. He said nothing. "I've hit that threshold," she said again, "for 7 years. At that angle, coming through the door at pace. Every time." He waited. "And I never thought to fix it," she said. And the way she said it had nothing to do with the threshold. He crouched back down and moved the chalk mark 2 millimeters. Adjusted the angle. Stood again. "It's in the report," he said. She looked at him. Not the evaluating look. Not the watchful, measuring look she turned on most things. Something more direct and more uncertain, two qualities she didn't usually allow to exist at the same time. Then she said, "Your daughter. Patricia mentioned you have a daughter." 7, he said. "Clover." She paused. "Does she come to sites with you?" "Sometimes after school," he said. "She does her homework in whatever corner is flattest." He said it without particular inflection, the way he said most things, and watched Nora process it, with the slight softening around the eyes he was beginning to understand, the closest she usually came to an outward reaction. That's it. That was the 3rd day. He submitted the audit report on a Friday. He did not expect to hear from Nora Callahan again. On Monday morning, she called his firm's main number and left a message that was not a question exactly, but was structured like one. The renovation brief, she said, did not include a complete redesign of the entrance approach. She said there were elements of the audit findings that she wanted to discuss before they went to the contractor. She said she would be available Wednesday. He called back and said Wednesday was fine. The building was quiet when he arrived on Wednesday morning, not the performing quiet of a space trying to project calm, but the actual quiet of a building in the hour before full occupancy. When the heat system ticked and the coffee was brewing somewhere above the lobby, and the light through the east windows was the flat pewter light of December in Portland. Nora was already at her desk when Patricia brought him to the executive floor. The desk was near the window that overlooked the corner intersection, and she was reading something in a printed document, pen in hand, making small notes in the margin. She did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was marking, set the pen at the edge of the paper, then looked up. "The report is thorough," she said. "Thank you," he said. "It's also inconvenient." "I know." She gestured to the chair on the other side of the desk. He sat. She turned the report to face him. She had, he noticed, already done her own annotations, a second layer of notes in a different ink. Questions and observations running alongside the margins he hadn't written in. "You flagged the lobby entrance, the 3rd floor turning radius, and the elevator bank alcove as priority 1, she said. "Walk me through the logic on the alcove." "My original contractor graded that as compliant." He walked her through the logic. She listened, asked 2 precise questions, wrote something in her margin. Then she turned to the next flagged item and did the same thing. This continued for 90 minutes. The meeting had the quality of a professional exchange between equals, which was the only kind of exchange, he would later understand, that Nora Callahan was willing to have. She engaged with the audit findings the way she engaged with financial reports, as data that existed to be interrogated, not deferred to. She pushed back on 3 items, and in 2 of the 3 she was right. And he said so. And in the 3rd she was applying a standard that was based on the original spec rather than current best practice. And he said that too. And she looked at him for a long moment and then wrote in the margin, "Confirm current standard." He confirmed it, pulling up the updated guidance on his phone and turning it to face her. She read it. Wrote, "Update required." "I want to add something to the scope," she said, at the end of the 90 minutes. He waited. The building's original design included a courtyard entry from the east side. She said, "It was closed off in a renovation 8 years ago. I want to explore reopening it. It creates a secondary approach from street level that doesn't require navigating the main entrance, which, as you've pointed out, has a number of compounding issues in the existing configuration." He pulled up the floor plan on his clipboard, looked at the east face, nodded once. "That's a significant scope addition," he said. "I know. You'll want a design consultant in addition to the compliance audit." She looked at him. He kept his expression neutral and looked at the floor plan. "I know someone," he said. "I can make the introduction." She looked at him for another beat and then said she would need the introduction by the end of the week, and the meeting was finished. He left the building and stood on the corner in the December cold and thought about the particular quality of working with a person who matched you speed for speed and expected you to keep up. He had not experienced that in a professional context in some time. He had not expected to experience it here. Clover had a question for him at dinner that night, which was nothing unusual because Clover was a child who treated the dinner table as an interrogation venue. "What are you building?" she asked, because she had no concept of auditing versus building and was not interested in acquiring one. "A building," he said. "Not building it. Looking at it." "What for?" "To find the parts that don't work right." "Can you fix them?" "Someone else fixes them. I just find them." She considered this across her pasta. "So you're like a building doctor." "Something like that." "Does the building feel better after?" He looked at his daughter. She asked questions like that. The questions that went all the way through. The ones Iris would have asked. "I don't know," he said. "I hope so." He returned to the building 12 times over the following 6 weeks. Not all of the visits were strictly necessary for the audit scope. Some of them were follow-up consultations that Nora requested directly, via Patricia, in the form of calendar invitations that had subject lines like revised entrance brief and courtyard approach questions. Dean accepted each one and prepared for each one with the same thoroughness he brought to every job, and told himself this was routine. It was not routine. What was happening underneath the professional overlay of site visits and floor plans and revision schedules was something that both of them were treating carefully and neither of them was discussing. A slow accumulated learning of the way the other person thought. The way Nora moved through a problem. Her preference for following the logic to its conclusion before considering alternatives. Her intolerance for presentations that buried the difficulty. The way Dean read a space, physically and architecturally, his habit of moving around the perimeter before the center. His tendency to crouch rather than bend when he was looking at floor-level details. She had stopped being visibly watchful with him somewhere around the 4th visit. The particular quality of monitoring, the slight readiness for provocation, the angled positioning that gave her maximum observation of the room, had eased into something more like ordinary alertness. She was still precise, still direct, still capable when a contractor submitted a revised plan that buried 3 of the audit corrections under new line items, of producing an annotated rebuttal in 20 minutes that was masterful in its controlled exactness. But with Dean specifically, the monitoring had stepped back, not disappeared. Stepped back, the way a door stood open rather than closed. He noticed. He didn't say so. Clover was the one who made it visible. She had come to the building on a Thursday afternoon in mid-December, the second Thursday before the winter holidays began, when her school had let out early for a teachers' meeting and Dean's original childcare arrangement had fallen through at noon. She had her backpack and her homework folder and the small blue notebook she carried everywhere, which she used for drawings she called documentation. He had called Patricia, who had cleared the visit with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had been hoping for exactly this complication. Clover was a precise child, compact and observant. With her mother's dark eyes and Dean's habit of going quiet before she said something that mattered. She entered the lobby of the Callahan Meridian building the way she entered most new spaces, slowly, taking inventory. "It's tall," she said, meaning the atrium. 10 floors, Dean said. She looked up at the glass roof. Then she took out her blue notebook and drew it. She drew in corners as a general rule. Wherever Dean was working, Clover found the flattest nearby surface, opened the notebook, and drew whatever was in front of her. She drew the lobby while Dean was in his 4th floor meeting with the contractor's representative, and she drew the 4th floor corridor while he was reviewing the entrance approach documents with Patricia. And she drew the east-facing windows on the 6th floor, which had good light, while Dean was in the adjacent room going over the courtyard proposal with the design consultant he'd introduced to Nora 2 weeks prior. Nora found her there. Dean was still in the adjacent room. Clover was sitting cross-legged on the floor against the window, notebook on her knee, drawing the window frame. She looked up when Nora's chair came through the doorway and did not look alarmed. Because Clover was a child who was not easily alarmed, and because Nora's manner, whatever its effect on adults, tended to register to children as simply direct rather than intimidating. "You're the dad's daughter," Nora said. Clover confirmed this. "What are you drawing?" Nora asked. "The window frame," Clover said. She turned the notebook to show her. The drawing was detailed for a 7-year-old. She had the proportions approximately right and had added in the chalk mark Dean had made on the threshold below as a small horizontal line, which she had observed but not asked about. Nora looked at the drawing. She looked at it for long enough that Clover added a correction to the frame's upper edge. "You got the sill wrong," Nora said. "It's wider than that." The original design had a wider sill on the east face. Clover looked at the window, looked at the drawing, erased and redrew. "Like that?" "Closer," Nora said. There was a pause. "Why is there a chalk mark on the floor?" Clover asked. "That's your father's," Nora said. "He marks the things that need to be changed." Clover looked at the chalk mark and then at Nora and said, with the specific guileless quality she deployed when she was asking something she had already mostly worked out, "Is there a lot of stuff that needs to be changed?" "Yes," Nora said. "Do you mind?" Clover asked it the way she asked all direct questions, without preamble. As if the question were obvious, and the only unusual thing was that no one had said it yet. Nora was quiet for a moment. "I built this building," she said. "I designed it before the accident." She paused. "Before I used this." She indicated the chair with a slight movement, the gesture of someone who had been making that gesture for years. Not uncomfortable, simply factual. "Oh," Clover said. "So you made it wrong for yourself." "Not wrong on purpose," Nora said. "Wrong because I didn't know yet what I'd need." Clover processed this. "That seems like a hard thing." "It is," Nora said. Clover looked at the notebook. Then she said, "Dad says most buildings are built for only one kind of person. He says that's the part he's trying to fix." "Does he?" Nora said. "He says the people who design things forget that other people will use them." She turned a page and started drawing the chalk mark on the floor, the small clean line Dean had made 6 weeks ago, and which was still there because nothing had been corrected yet in the old lobby entrance. "He noticed you," Clover said, still drawing, "before he ever talked to you. He said the building told him who lived in it." Nora looked at her. "He says buildings are honest," Clover said, with the authority of someone reporting established fact. "He says they always tell the truth if you know how to read them." In the adjacent room, Dean had finished with the contractor's representative and came through the door and found Nora facing the window with his daughter on the floor beside her, and the quality of the silence between them was not the silence of two strangers, but of two people who had been in the middle of something. He looked at Clover. Clover looked at him. "She told me about the chalk marks," Clover said, meaning Nora. Dean looked at Nora. Nora was looking at the drawing in Clover's notebook. Her expression was the expression that had no good name yet, the one that was not the professional face, but had not yet been assigned another category. "We were discussing the sill width," Nora said. Dean looked at the drawing, at the corrected sill, at the chalk mark Clover had documented. He said, "The wider sill is right. It was in the original design brief." "I know," Nora said. "I wrote it." And the room held all three of them, in the flat winter light of the 6th floor, and nobody said anything more about it, and the silence was not uncomfortable. That was the moment something shifted that was not professional. After that Thursday, Clover came to the building once more before winter break. She came on the last Wednesday of December, which was not a school day, but was a day Dean had a site walk with the design consultant, and she came because she had decided without asking that the documentation of the building was not finished. She had 4 drawings she considered incomplete, and she needed better light on the east face to correct the window proportions. She documented the lobby threshold with Dean's chalk mark, the 4th floor corridor from 2 angles, the elevator bank buttons with heights marked in her own approximate notation, and finally, the north stairwell exit door with the crash bar, which she drew with the label heavy door in her careful child's handwriting. She gave the heavy door drawing to Nora on the way out. Nora held it and said, "You labeled it. It is heavy," Clover said. "It should say so." Nora looked at the drawing for a long time. She said to Dean, She's been here 3 times, he said. She says the documentation isn't finished. Nora said, quietly, she's right. She kept the drawing. She put it on the windowsill of her office alongside the earlier ones, which she had not mentioned keeping, and which she had arranged in a careful row. The lobby, the corridor, the window frame with the corrected sill, and now the heavy door. Dean looked at the row of drawings and said nothing. Nora said, there's a business I want to talk to you about. He said, okay. She said, not now, after the board meeting. If the board meeting goes the way I intend it to go. He said, and if it doesn't. She said, then I'll still want to talk to you about it, and we'll figure out the rest from there. He said, okay. She said, you are very easy to talk to. He said, you're not. She looked at him sharply. He said, I mean that as a compliment. Most things that are easy to open don't hold much. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, that's the most architectural thing anyone has ever said to me. He said, it's the most honest thing I can say. The room was quiet. Outside, the December sky was doing what December skies did in Portland, producing a light that was gray and even and sufficient, the kind of light that showed things clearly without making them dramatic. She turned back to the floor plans and said, the east entrance needs a final review before the board meeting. I want you there for that too. He said, I'll be there. And she nodded, which was Nora's version of thank you, and they worked. Elliot Shade had been Nora's COO for 5 years. He was a man of genuine competence and genuine concern, which made him considerably more dangerous than a man of only one of those qualities. He had hired well and managed well, and in the years since Nora's accident, had taken on a gradual expansion of operational responsibilities that had never been officially formalized but had accumulated by default. The way water found the path of least resistance. He covered when Nora had medical appointments that ran long. He managed the cross-department briefings when she was traveling. He had, 4 times in the preceding year, stepped in for board calls that she had not been able to join. He genuinely believed he was doing this because it was good for the company. Dean had enough experience reading structures to know that a person could believe something sincerely and still be constructing something that served them. He met Elliot Shade on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of January, in the lobby, where Elliot was reviewing the renovation contractor's revised timeline with the project manager. Dean was there for a site inspection of the east entrance framing, which was now partially open. Elliot was a tall man in his late 40s, who had the smooth competence of someone who had learned to make his authority look like service. You're the compliance consultant, Elliot said, with the tone of someone who had been told about him and had formed a view. Accessibility consultant, Dean said. Right, Elliot said. He asked a few questions about the east entrance timeline, and Dean answered them. Then Elliot said, still with the tone of genuine concern, it's good work. This building has needed this for a long time. Dean said, it has. I've been saying for years that it needed a more comprehensive look, Elliot said. Nora has always been hesitant to take outside help on structural matters. She's protective of the original design. He said it with warmth. The warmth was real. And underneath the warmth was a frame that Dean recognized, the frame that said Nora's protectiveness was a limitation rather than a characteristic, that her hesitation to accept help was the problem rather than something that had context. He wrote what needed writing in his inspection notes, and didn't engage the frame. But he remembered it. There were other things he noticed about Elliot Shade in the weeks that followed. The small behavioral tells of a person who had been very gradually and very sincerely redefining their role. Elliot greeted vendors who came to the building as though he was the primary contact. Elliot's name appeared first on several contractor communications that should have been addressed to Nora's office. Elliot had arranged a lunch with 2 of the company's longest tenure board members in early January, which Patricia had mentioned in passing with the careful neutrality she brought to the things she wanted Dean to know without saying she wanted him to know them. None of it was dramatic. All of it was structural. Dean understood structural better than dramatic. He told Nora about the Elliot encounter that afternoon, directly, without editorializing. He told her what Elliot had said and used Elliot's exact words. She was quiet for a moment. He means well, she said. I know, Dean said. He's been saying that for 2 years, she said. In board meetings. In one-on-ones. in emails to members of the board that I'm not copied on, that I find out about the same way anyone finds out about things they're not supposed to know, because the building has a sound carry issue on the third-floor corridor and people forget. Dean looked at her. He wants to call a board review of executive decision-making capacity, she said. That was the phrase in the email I wasn't supposed to hear. Decision-making capacity. That's not concern, Dean said. That's positioning. No, she said. The concern is real. That's what makes it complicated. He does think this is what's best for me. He has built a whole story about me in his mind in which I am a woman who is too wounded and too stubborn to accept the help she needs. And in that story, what he is doing is merciful. And is it? Dean said, not gently, not harshly, the way you asked a structural question, as information. She looked at him. Not the evaluating look, the direct look, the one that had appeared the day of the chalk mark. No, she said. It's condescension that has learned to call itself care. Dean wrote that down in his notebook, not because he needed to, but because it was precise. He said, "What do you need from me, practically, before the board review?" She told him. He listened. And then they worked. The wound came out 2 days later, not in the board meeting preparation, but in a Tuesday afternoon that had no scheduled reason for the conversation, which was how the real conversations happened. Dean was reviewing the east entrance framing documents at the table in the small conference room on the 4th floor that Patricia had given him as a working space. Nora appeared in the doorway, not hurrying, not with a purpose, she announced. She came in and sat at the other end of the table, and for a moment said nothing, just looked at the floor plan spread in front of him. He waited. She said, "I want to tell you something about the 7 years." He said, "Okay." She said, "When I came back to this building after the accident and the hospital and the rehabilitation, I made a decision. The decision was that nothing about my work would reference the accident. Not the building, not the decisions I made, not the way I ran meetings or delegated tasks or asked for things. The accident happened. I adapted. The adaptation was mine and not the company's and not the board's and not anyone else's to manage or comment on." He said, "That sounds right." She said, "It was right." For a long time, it was exactly right, because the alternative was being defined by it. And I have watched other people be defined by it, by accidents or illness or circumstances that became the first thing anyone saw when they looked at them, and I refused. He said, "But." She looked at him. He said it quietly, not pushing, just completing the logic she'd stopped at. "But," she said. The decision that nothing would reference it became, over time, a decision that nothing could reference it, that no one could ask, that I could never be the person who needed something to be different, that asking for the threshold to be corrected was the same as admitting the threshold had been a problem, and admitting the threshold had been a problem was admitting I had needed it to be different and could not make it different, which was, I had decided. The same as being diminished. She said it the way she said most true things, without exclamation, flat, like something being recorded. He said, the threshold had been a problem. She said, for 7 years. He said, and you knew. She said, I always knew. I knew every item on your list before you wrote it. I had been knowing them and not naming them, because naming them meant admitting they were mine to name. The room was quiet. She said, my father had a stroke. You know that from the public record. What you don't know is that my father was in this building 3 weeks before the accident. He walked through the lobby and through the east corridor and through the conference rooms on 9 and 10. And I was with him, and I watched him move through every space I had designed, and I watched him navigate the small difficulties. The door that required a push, the corridor that narrowed, the restroom that was 18 inches too small for the walker he was using at the time. She stopped. He said nothing. She said. He never said a word. He came through the building and he didn't say anything about any of it, and I didn't say anything about any of it, and 3 weeks later I was in the hospital, and the building became mine entirely, and I came back and moved through every space he had moved through and felt every difficulty he had felt. And I still said nothing. because saying something meant saying it had been wrong, and my father had deserved better from a building I designed, and I could not say that. The sentence ended. The room held it. He said, very quietly, that wasn't about the building. No, she said. It wasn't. She looked at her hands. She said, I kept the refusal because it was the only way I knew to not be someone who had failed him. If I never fixed it, I never had to look directly at the fact that I had built it wrong in the first place. He said, you built it before you knew. I know that, she said. Knowing it logically and living it differently are two separate things. He said, yes. She said, this is the first time I've said any of this to another person. He said, I know. She looked at him. He said, the way you talk about the building, the way you know every item on the list before I name it. Nobody accumulates that inventory without carrying it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, your wife, did she know about the way you carry things? He said, yes. She said, tell me. And he told her, not the polished version he had learned to tell in the years since, the real one. The one that started with Iris in the kitchen on a November morning, and her saying, I want to go to the coast this weekend, and him saying maybe next month because of a project deadline, and the weekend after that being a different deadline, and then 6 months later the diagnosis, and then 7 months after that, the last November that was the last everything. He said, she said once that I was very good at seeing what needed to be corrected, and very careful about seeing what I had already made wrong. Nora said, she was right about that. He said, yes. Nora said, she sounds like she was precise. He said, she was. She was the most precise person I've ever known, and she had no patience for evasion, and she loved Clover with a completeness that I don't think I will ever have a sufficient word for. He stopped. Nora said, you carry her. He said, every day. They sat in the conference room with the floor plans between them and the winter light through the east windows and the building quiet around them. And neither of them said anything for a long while, and the silence was not empty. It was the silence of two people who had both been carrying something heavy for years and had just set it down, very carefully, in the same place. The setback came on a Friday in late January, and it came without warning, the way real setbacks did. The east entrance project had been moving forward. The contractor had scheduled the final threshold corrections for the first week of February, the renovation scope was on track, and the board review that Elliot had filed was scheduled for the 14th, which gave Nora 2 weeks to prepare. Dean had been helping her build the documentation. Then the contractor called Patricia at 10 on a Friday morning and told her, in the particular tone of someone delivering news they had been sitting on for 24 hours, that a structural issue had been found in the east wall framing during the final construction phase. The issue was not safety critical, but it required immediate remediation, and remediation required a design engineer assessment, and the design engineer was not available until mid-March. The east entrance opening was delayed by 6 weeks. Minimum, Dean was in the building when the call came. He heard it from across the room. Not the words, but the quality of the response. The shift in Patricia's voice from professional to careful. He found Nora in her office at noon. She was at the window. Not working. At the window. He said, I heard. She said, 6 weeks after the board review. The east entrance was going to be the concrete demonstration. The building correcting itself. An opening that had been closed for 8 years, open again. He said, I know. She said, Elliot will use it. He'll say the project is behind schedule. He'll say I authorized a renovation scope that hit structural complications because my judgment about the building is impaired by personal investment. He said, he'll be wrong about the impairment but right about the delay. She said, yes. He said, so we build around it. The delay is real. The reason for it is that the correction revealed a structural problem that had been hidden under a surface finish for years. That's not a failure of the renovation scope. That's the renovation scope working. She turned from the window. He said, a building that hides problems when you leave it alone reveals them when you fix it properly. That's not an argument against fixing it. That's the argument for it. You document it that way, and Elliot's framing falls apart. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You think very fast." He said, "I've been in a lot of buildings where the problem showed up after you started." She said, "And what do you do?" He said, "You note it. You correct it. You don't pretend it wasn't there." She was quiet. Then she said, "The board review is in 2 weeks." He said, "I'll be there." She said, "I haven't asked you to be there." He said, "No." The room was very still. She said, "I'm asking you now." He said, "I'll be there." And she looked at him with the look that had no good name yet, the one that was still learning the street names, and went back to her desk, and he went back to the documentation, and they worked through the afternoon in the particular quiet of two people who had agreed on something without making a ceremony of it. The setback came in February, and it came from the direction Dean had not been watching. He had been watching Elliot. He had been watching the board communications. He had been tracking, with the methodical attention he brought to load-bearing elements, the structural pressures being applied to Nora's position from the outside. What he had not been watching was himself. The renovation project had concluded, formally, in January. His firm's contract had been fulfilled. The audit report was complete. The compliance deficiencies had been corrected or were corrected in the active renovation scope, and the east entrance was opening in March, and the job was done. There was no professional reason for him to continue visiting the building. He had continued visiting the building, not every day, not even every week. But the conversations with Nora had not stopped when the job did. They had shifted from meetings about door clearances to conversations about the kind of things two people talked about when they had been meeting weekly for 2 months, and had developed a mutual trust that neither of them had decided to develop, but both of them had noticed. He had told her about Iris. Not in a single conversation, but in fragments across several. The way you told someone about a person who mattered when you hadn't fully decided you were going to. He told her that Iris had been a high school biology teacher, and that she had liked things that were precise and things that were alive, and he told her that the ovarian cancer had been diagnosed in September and she had died in the following April, which was 7 months, and which was both longer and shorter than either of them had known what to do with. Nora had listened with the quality of attention she brought to everything, complete and quiet, without the impatient anticipation of her own response that characterized most people's listening. She had said after a pause, "That 7 months was enough time to understand that you were going to lose someone, and not enough time to understand what losing them would feel like." He had said, "Yes." That she had looked at her hands and then away, and he had understood without pressing that she was thinking about something parallel and not yet ready to name it. The setback in February was this: he pulled back. Not because of Nora, because of himself, and because of Clover, and because of the specific vertigo that came from recognizing that something mattered before you had decided whether to let it matter. He was in the building on a Tuesday afternoon when Clover was at school, there at Nora's request, to look at the east entrance framing before the contractor closed in the last section. It was a professional visit. He told himself this the way you told yourself things you were not quite certain of. He was in the entrance corridor measuring the final threshold correction when Nora came through from the interior, moving at her usual pace, and they nearly collided in the turn, and she checked her chair with the ease of long practice, and he stepped back, and they were suddenly 2 feet apart in a corridor that was narrow enough that 2 feet was close. She looked up at him. He looked at her. The chalk mark was directly beneath his left foot. The threshold he had marked, the one that had been in the building for 47 years, the one she had told him she had hit 100 times without naming it, was now corrected, a smooth feathered transition in new concrete, barely visible. Exactly right. They were standing at the threshold. He thought about Iris. He thought about Clover at 7 years old, learning to be brave and not entirely knowing the mechanism of her own bravery. He thought about the specific cost of wanting something that you had already lost once. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for the next part of this," he said. "Whatever this is." The conversation, the visits, he stopped. "I have a daughter, and I made her a set of promises about what I would and wouldn't risk. And I'm not sure this is something I should be standing in front of." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "You're afraid," she said. "Yes," he said. She said nothing else. She moved past him into the entrance and through the exterior door, and he stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the corrected threshold, and then he left the building. He did not come back for 2 weeks. The 2 weeks were not quiet weeks. Internally, he did the work he was supposed to do. The other contracts, the other sites. The other buildings with their own load-bearing failures and their own good intentions that had stopped 1 degree short. He picked up Clover from school and made dinner and sat at the table while she told him things, and listened to her, and tried to be the version of himself that was entirely present for this particular child who needed him to be entire. Clover noticed. She noticed on the 4th day, and she sat across from him at dinner and said, "You're sad again." He said he was okay. "That's not what I asked," she said, which was something she said frequently and which came directly from Iris. He looked at his daughter. He said, "I'm not sure I made a good decision." "About what?" He thought about how to say it. He said, "About something that matters." Clover ate her pasta. Then she said, "Mama said the only decisions you regret are the ones where you chose the safe thing and got smaller." He looked at her. "She told me when I was scared to tell Mrs. Hartley about Owen taking my eraser," Clover said. "She said people who choose the safe thing all the time eventually don't know how to be brave at all." She said this with the complete confidence of someone who had once been told something true and had retained it perfectly. Dean sat with that for a moment. Then he called Patricia and asked if Nora had any time in the next 2 weeks. She had 30 minutes on a Tuesday morning, Patricia said. That was what was available. He took it. He arrived at the building with nothing prepared, which was not his usual way, because he had decided that preparation in this context was another form of the safe choice. He asked for Nora, and Patricia sent him to the executive floor, and he went up in the elevator and came out into the corridor and walked to the end and knocked on the open door of her office. She was at her desk. She was reading. She looked up without hurry, the way she did everything. He said, "I was wrong." She looked at him. "Not about being afraid," he said. "I was right about that. I am afraid. But I was wrong about the conclusion I drew from it." She said nothing. She was looking at him with the direct, waiting quality she brought to things that required hearing to the end. He said, "The decision I was making, the decision to protect Clover from the risk of something not working out, I have been making that decision for 3 years, and I think I have been getting it wrong for most of them." A pause. He said, "Clover has a dead mother. She knows the cost. She has known it since she was 4. And she is the least afraid person I have ever met, because she has already survived the worst thing, and she knows that surviving it doesn't work by not being present for anything." He stopped. Then he said, "That was the one thing." Nora looked at him. "You said I could name what I was afraid of," he said. "And that was it. I was afraid that wanting something meant I would have to survive losing it again. And the thing I understood from my daughter, who is 7 and probably wiser than I deserve, is that the alternative is not safety. The alternative is smaller." The office was quiet. Nora said, "I know." He waited. "I know," she said again, and it was not agreement with what he'd said. Not entirely. It was something else. She was looking at the window. At the east courtyard, through the glass where the new entrance was taking shape, the framing opened to the gray February sky. She said, "When the accident happened," she said, "I lost the ability to walk. That was real, and it was enormous, and I don't minimize it. But that wasn't the part that I couldn't get over." He listened. "The part I couldn't get over," she said, "was that I lost confidence in my own judgment. The thing that had always been mine, the ability to read a situation, to see a problem clearly, to know what needed to be done, I lost faith in that. Because I had designed this building, and I had done it wrong. I had built something for other people without understanding what they actually needed. And I thought if I had been that wrong about something I should have understood, then I could be wrong about everything." Dean said quietly, "You weren't wrong about the building. You were designing it from outside your own need, because you didn't know yet." "I know that now," she said. She looked at him. It took someone standing in it with chalk and reading it the way I couldn't read it to show me the difference. He sat down in the chair across from her desk without being asked, which was a thing he had not done before. He said, "The board review." She said, "Elliot filed the request last week. It goes to the full board on the 14th. He said, "Tell me what you need." She said, "I need someone to say what you said." To the board. He said, "I'll be there." She looked at him for a long moment. Not the measuring look. Not the evaluating look. The look that had been growing under the others for 3 months. The one that was still learning the names of the streets. Then she picked up her pen and went back to her reading, and he sat across from her desk. And he didn't go anywhere, and neither did she. The board meeting was on a Tuesday. The room was the executive conference room on the 9th floor, the one with the long table and the view of the city, and the sound carry issue in the corridor that Nora had mentioned once, and that Dean had noted in the building's acoustic profile. 12 board members. Elliot on one side of the table, prepared and composed and genuinely believing in what he was about to do. Nora at the head of the table, which was where she sat for every board meeting, where she had sat for 11 years. Dean was not a board member. He was there as a professional witness, a fact that Patricia had arranged with precise administrative competence that left Elliot no procedural avenue to object to. He sat against the wall, which was not unusual for an outside consultant at a board review, and he watched. Elliot presented the case. He did it well, which was what Dean had expected. He framed it in the language of care, the escalating operational load, the pattern of delegated responsibilities that had exceeded ordinary COO scope, the question of whether the current structure was sustainable. He named no deficiencies in Nora's performance because there were none to name. He named instead a concern for capacity, for sustainability, for the well-being of a leader who had been carrying too much alone for too long. He said the word help 3 times. Dean watched the board. He had spent 3 months in this building, and he knew which members of the board had been in Elliot's orbit and which had not. He had read their correspondence patterns in the documents Nora had shared with him during the board review preparation. He had formed a picture of the room before he sat in it. The board listened. Several of them were nodding with the slow nods of people who had been partially convinced before the meeting began. 2 of them were not nodding. They were watching Nora. Then Nora spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform emotion. She laid out, in the precise, unhurried register she brought to everything, the operational record of the company over the preceding 3 years, the revenue trajectory, the market expansion, the successful navigation of 2 significant regulatory changes in the industry, the board's own approved metrics. Every single one of them met or exceeded. She laid this out the way you laid out a floor plan, completely, so that the structure was visible without narration. Then she said, "The question before this board is not whether I am capable of leading this company. The record settles that. The question is whether a board member's concern for my capacity, however genuinely held, constitutes a sufficient basis for a review that has no procedural precursor in company governance." She looked at Elliot. She said, "The answer is no." And then she said, "I want to introduce Dean Marsh, who was retained by this company's legal team for a compliance audit 6 months ago, and who found 32 structural deficiencies in the building I designed, personally, before my accident. I want to tell you what he told me when I asked him how I had missed them." The room was quiet. She said, "He said I was designing from outside my own need, that I couldn't see what the building required because I wasn't standing inside the requirement yet." And then she said, "I have spent 7 years running this company from inside requirements I have not shared with anyone, because I believed that sharing them was the same as failing to meet them. And I was wrong. Not about the company, about myself." She looked at the room. She said, "I am not the woman who needs help because she uses a wheelchair. I am the woman who needed help understanding what her building needed, because the building needed what I had stopped letting myself acknowledge that I understood. And I understand it now." She said, "The review is not necessary." And I believe you all know that. 3 board members who had been nodding now weren't. 2 who had been watching her throughout looked at each other briefly and looked back. Elliot was very still. Dean looked at Nora. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the room, the 12 faces, the people she had been leading for 11 years, and her posture was the particular posture he had come to know over 6 months, not defensive, not closed, but open in a way that was structural rather than soft. The posture of a building that knew what it was holding. The review was voted down. 8-4. Elliot received the result with the composed dignity of a man who had genuinely believed in his cause and was genuinely wrong. Afterward, in the corridor, he found Dean near the elevator. He said, with the specific exhaustion of someone who had arrived at a hard truth, "You told her how to do that." Dean said, "She already knew how to do that." A pause. "She's been doing this alone for 7 years, Elliot said. "Yes," Dean said. "I didn't think of it as alone," Elliot said. "I thought of it as isolating." "There's a difference," Dean said. Elliot stood in the corridor for a long moment with the particular quality of a person reassembling their understanding of something they thought they had understood. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had told himself a story about a woman that served his own purposes and had believed it so completely that the belief had become, in his mind, indistinguishable from care. He would find his way to something more accurate. Eventually, Dean had seen that process in contractors too. The moment when the person who had submitted the compliant design looked at the correction list and understood, not as a professional defeat, but as a genuine revelation, that being technically correct and being actually right were not the same measurement. He said, "At last, I'll need to rethink several things." Dean said, "Yes, you will." He didn't say it harshly. He said it the way he said most things, as information. Elliot went back into the conference room. Dean went to find Nora. She was not in her office. She was not on the 9th floor. He checked the 8th and found her in the small conference room at the end of the east corridor, the one with the window that faced the courtyard framing, the one where the renovation was visible from the inside. She was at the table with the window in front of her and nothing in her hands, which was unusual for Nora, who was almost always holding something. A pen, a document, a phone. Her hands were flat on the table, and she was looking at the window. He came in and sat across from her. She said, 8-4. He said, "Yes." A pause. She said, "I didn't plan to say what I said about the building, the part about designing from outside my own need. I had prepared 12 minutes of performance and evidence, and I delivered 2 minutes of truth instead, and I don't fully understand why." He said, "Because the prepared version was the one that would have convinced them, and the unprepared version was the one that was true, and in 7 years of running this company, you have learned that the true version always carries the room better." She was quiet. He said, "And because you trusted the room." She said, "I trusted you were in it." He looked at her. She said, "I know that's not the whole of it. I know the record is the record. But the record would have been enough on paper, and something about your being here meant I could say the other thing as well. The building thing. The thing I haven't said out loud before." He said, "I know." She said, "You keep saying I know as though everything I tell you is already filed somewhere you can retrieve it." He said, "Most of it is." She looked at him with something that was close to a smile and close to exasperation and was entirely hers. She said, "Elliot will be different after this." He said, "He'll be better. He's not a bad person. He built the wrong story about you, and he believed it. And he was wrong. That's fixable." She said, "Most things are fixable." He said, "Most things." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the window, at the framing of the east entrance through the glass. Then she said, "I want to tell you what happens after the board vote." He said, "Okay." She said, "The company. I want to build it. I want to do the work you do. The work of finding the buildings that were designed outside the requirement and correcting what was correctable and documenting what wasn't, but at scale and with the weight of a company behind it that has the resources to stay in conversations when contractors and facilities committees want to close them." She said, "I've been working on the brief for 3 months." She pulled a folder from beside the window that he had not seen until now. She opened it to a typed page and turned it to face him. He read the first section. He said, "This is the right idea." She said, "I know. Tell me where the thinking is wrong." He read further. He said, "The pricing model assumes the market understands what you're doing. It doesn't yet." She said, "It will." He said, "Yes. But you need a bridge between the current understanding and the future one. A place to start the conversation that doesn't require the client to already believe the correction matters." She said, "How do you do that in your current work?" He said, "I don't ask them to believe the correction matters. I show them the 32 items, and I ask them which ones they want to explain to a lawyer." She considered this. She said, "That's effective, and it's not the whole story." He said, "No, but it gets the door open. The rest of the story comes after." She wrote something in the margin of the page. She said, "I need a co-founder." He said, "I know." She said, "Someone with operational experience who understands buildings from the inside rather than from the policy document." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm reading you an offer." He said, "I know." She looked at him. He said, "My answer is yes." She said, "I haven't finished the offer." He said, "I know. My answer is still yes." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the folder. Then she said, "We'll need to discuss the equity structure." He said, "We will." She said, "I have opinions about the equity structure." He said, "I assumed." She said, "My opinions are correct." He said, "Some of them." She looked up sharply. He said, "We'll discuss it." She turned a page in the folder and said, "The name." He said, "Threshold Design." She said it out loud, quietly, the moment between spaces, the point of transition, the thing that determines whether the entry is possible. He said, "Yes." She said, "That's what this is." He said, "Yes." She was in the atrium on the ground floor, near the old entrance, near the threshold. She was facing the east corridor, the new opening, the doorway that was not yet complete, but was framed and plumb and leading out toward the courtyard that had been closed for 8 years. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside her. She said without looking at him, "I haven't walked through there yet." He looked at the framed opening. The threshold was smooth, the new concrete pale and exact, the correction he'd specified months ago built perfectly into the foundation. On the upper left side of the doorframe, in faint chalk that had not been washed away, was the mark he'd made in November. The small horizontal line, the one that showed the angle. He said, "There's no rush." She said, "There's a question I've been avoiding." He looked at her. She said, "For 3 months I've been having a sensation I don't know how to account for. In my right foot. During the physical therapy sessions I've been doing, the ones I didn't tell anyone about, the ones I started in October." He was very still. She said, "My therapist thinks it may be the beginning of partial sensation return. She's conservative about it. She won't make a prognosis. But the sensation is there, and I can't unknow that it's there." He said, "Okay." She said, "I didn't tell you because it felt too large to say out loud without knowing what it meant." He said, "Does it still feel too large?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." She looked at him. He was looking at the threshold. She said, "The one thing." He looked at her. She said, "You told me you were afraid." That was the one thing no one had ever said to me. Every person who has come through this office in 7 years has been very careful not to be afraid in my presence. They were careful to be capable, or careful to be kind, or careful to be patient, or careful to project that they were certain everything would be fine, and every single one of them eventually left, because the careful was not enough. You were afraid, and you said so, and you stayed. He looked at her. She said, "That was the one thing I was waiting for. Not help, not a fix, not someone certain, someone honest about the cost who showed up anyway." The atrium was quiet. The winter light came through the east framing, pale and flat and sufficient. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the armrest. She looked at it. She turned her hand and held his. Then she looked at the threshold. She said, "I'm going to try." He said, "I'll be here." She moved toward the opening. He walked beside her, and she pushed through the threshold, through the door frame with the chalk mark at the top and the smooth new concrete at the base, through the opening that had been closed for 8 years, into the space that was becoming the east courtyard. The cold air and the winter light, and the city beyond the glass in all directions. She stopped at the center of the frame. She looked down at her feet. She put weight on her right foot, the deliberate, quiet effort of someone doing something that cost everything they had. And then, for 7 seconds, she stood. Not all the way, not with ease. The left hand still on the doorframe, the effort visible in every line of her body. But standing, the right foot bearing weight, the first time in 7 years, in the opening of a building she had designed wrong and corrected, and was still working on. She counted under her breath. He didn't ask her to stop. 7 seconds, she said. He said yes. She sat back, brought the weight back, let out a breath that was long and controlled, and only slightly unsteady. She did not look up immediately. She looked at the corrected threshold beneath the wheels of her chair, at the chalk mark on the frame, at the opening. Then she looked at him. He said, "That was real." She said, "Yes, it was." The physical therapy program had a name for it. Later, partial motor recovery, incomplete spinal cord, excellent prognosis with continued work. Her therapist would say in the coming months that she had seen cases like this before and had never taken one for granted. The progress would be slow. It would be real. It would require everything she had, and she had, it turned out, more than anyone had accounted for, including herself. But that was later. What mattered in that moment was the 7 seconds. And the chalk mark on the doorframe, and the man who had stood at the threshold and read the building and found what was wrong and stayed anyway. Threshold Design launched 6 months later, in June, with 2 clients and a clear brief: find the buildings that had been designed outside the requirement. Correct what was correctable. Document what wasn't. Find the 32 things no one had noticed. It was Nora's idea and Dean's name, and neither of them could have made it without the other, and neither of them pretended otherwise. The launch event was held in the east courtyard of the Callahan Meridian building, which was fully open now. The framing complete, the threshold smooth, the space between the interior and exterior finally, without impediment. Nora had insisted on the location. She said a company that built its case for accessible design should start in the place where the case had been made. Dean had agreed. The event was for clients and partners, and a press list that Patricia had assembled with the same precise efficiency she brought to everything. Nora had written the remarks herself. She did not ask Dean to review them. She stood at the front of the courtyard and spoke for 12 minutes. She talked about the gap between design intent and use reality, about the 32 items and what each of them had meant in the daily life of the person who had been moving through them for 7 years, about the kind of correction that was not a renovation, but an acknowledgement. A building saying, "I understand now what I should have understood before." She talked about the work Threshold Design would do and why it mattered, and what it cost to leave it undone. She did not talk about herself in the way that was self-regarding. She talked about the building, and the building's relationship to the person who used it, and the gap that persisted when those relationships were not honestly examined. Dean stood near the back. He had heard her prepare. He had not heard this version, which was the version that was less prepared than the others, which meant it was the version that was truest. When she finished, the room gave her the particular quality of applause that meant something had landed that people had not expected to receive. She found him after, in the moment when the event had settled into conversation and the lights of the courtyard were on, and the city was visible through the glass panels on all sides. Portland in the June evening, blue and lit and sufficient. She said, "The remarks were good." He said they were. She said, "I changed them this morning." He said, "I know. The morning version is always the one that's true." She looked at him. He said, "You wake up, and the performance is settled overnight, and what's left is the actual thing." She said, "That's very architectural." He said, "It's just true." She smiled. Not managed. Not suppressed. Simply there, the way things were there when a person had stopped spending energy on containment. Then, Clover appeared at Dean's side, notebook under her arm, and said, "I drew the courtyard. The new part." And she held up the notebook to show Nora, and Nora looked at it, And the thing she was looking at was not just the drawing. The months between the board meeting and the launch had been the months in which things were built. Not just the company. The company was the visible structure, the floor plan that could be shown to investors and clients and described in a brief. What was built in those months, the thing that was harder to name, was the other structure. The one made of 3-hour work sessions at her desk, and the particular silence of two people who had stopped being careful and started being present. They built the company the way they built everything, by starting with what the structure actually required, what the market actually needed, not what it claimed to need. Where the good intentions had stopped 1 degree short of use. There were real disagreements, 3 of them serious. One of them that lasted 4 days and involved 2 pages of written notes and a decision that neither of them fully liked and both of them could live with, which Dean knew from experience was the mark of a decision that was actually correct. Nora disagreed the way she disagreed with contractors, with documentation and specifics and no room for feelings to confuse the structural question. He found this more clarifying than he had expected. He had been in too many professional relationships where the disagreement was managed around rather than through, and managed around problems had a way of showing up later in places you hadn't expected. He told her this during the second serious disagreement about the company's fee structure, which she thought should be higher than he thought the market would bear at launch. She said, "You're thinking about what people are willing to pay for a service they don't fully understand yet." He said, "Yes." She said, "You should be thinking about what the service is worth." He said, "Those aren't the same number at the beginning." She said, "They will be. And if we start low, we anchor the perception of the service at a level it doesn't actually belong." He thought about this. He said, "You're right about the anchor." She said, "I know." He said, "We compromise at the midpoint, we revisit in 18 months. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Agreed." He wrote the midpoint into the brief. Neither of them made anything of the fact that they had just agreed on something. Clover asked about the company on a Thursday evening in March, which was 2 months before the launch, while she was doing homework at the kitchen table. She said, "The building you're working on, is it the same building?" He said, "A new one. A lot of new ones. We're starting a company." She said, "You and the building lady." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is she coming here?" He said, "Sometimes." She was quiet for a moment, drawing something in her notebook. Then she said, "Do you like her?" He said, "Yes." She looked up. He said, "I know what you're asking. Yes, I like her that way." Clover looked at him with the particular expression she had inherited from Iris, the one that meant she was assessing whether to say the thing she was already thinking. She said, "Is that okay?" He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Mama." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think your mama would like her. She doesn't perform for anyone either." Clover thought about this. She said, "She fixed the chalk mark." He said, "She authorized the correction. That's different." Clover said, "She kept the drawing I gave her." He said, "I know." Clover said, "I gave it to her because she should have it. Some things belong to the person they're about." He looked at his daughter. She said, with the simplicity of someone who had decided something and was not interested in being talked out of it, "I like her too." She went back to her homework. He sat with his coffee in the kitchen quiet and the particular thing that happened in his chest when Clover confirmed something he had been carefully not deciding. Nora came to the house for the first time on a Saturday in April, which was Clover's idea, and about which Dean had mixed feelings until the moment it happened, and then no feelings except the specific gratitude of seeing two people who were both very honest occupying the same room. She came because Clover had invited her, specifically, to see the drawing she had made of the building, the entire set. Clover had told Nora at the building on the previous Thursday that she had finished documenting the lobby renovation and wanted to show her the complete series, and Nora had said she would like to see them, and Clover had said then you should come to our house because they're all there. This was presented to Dean as established fact. Nora arrived at 3 in the afternoon with the particular composure of someone who had decided to do something slightly out of their ordinary and was not going to make the unusualness of it visible. Clover opened the door and said, "Come in," and immediately began the tour of the drawings, which were laid out on the kitchen table in the order she had made them. Nora sat at the table and looked at each one carefully. She asked questions about specific details, the proportions of the elevator alcove, the angle of the corridor drawing, why Clover had made the chalk mark red in the third drawing when it was white chalk. Clover said, "Because red is the color of the thing that needs attention. The chalk was white, but the meaning is red." Nora looked at her for a moment. She said, "That's correct." Clover accepted this with the nod of someone who had not doubted it. They stayed for 2 hours. Clover made the drawing tour twice, because the second time through Nora asked different questions, and Clover had more to say. Dean made coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the two of them at the table and thought about the particular quality of a thing that had happened without being planned. When Nora left, Clover stood in the doorway and said, to her back as she navigated the front path, "Come back." Nora turned. Clover said, "I mean it. You can come back." Nora said, "I know you mean it." She looked at Dean briefly. She said, "Thank you." He said, "She invited you." She said, "Yes, but you let her." She turned and went down the path, and he stood in the doorway for a moment after she was gone, watching the street, and felt something he recognized from a long time ago and had not felt since. The specific and uncomplicated certainty of the right direction. He said nothing about it to anyone. He didn't need to. The company launched in May. They called it Threshold Design. Clover came to the launch event at the east courtyard of the Callahan Meridian building, which was fully open by then, the framing complete, the threshold correct, the space between the interior and exterior finally without impediment. She wore a yellow dress that had been Iris's choice years ago, a detail that Dean had not planned and noticed without saying anything, and she stood near the doorframe and drew the courtyard in her blue notebook. Nora found her there, later in the evening, when the event had settled into the easy noise of people who had come to see something built. "You're drawing the courtyard," Nora said. Clover confirmed this. She held up the notebook. The drawing was good. She had gotten the proportions right this time, the east wall, the glass panels, the threshold, and there in the upper corner of the doorframe she had drawn the chalk mark. Small and precise, exactly where it was. "I documented it," Clover said. Nora looked at the drawing. She looked at it for a long time. She said, "You should sign it." Clover signed the lower right corner and gave it to Nora. Nora held it carefully. She said, quietly, that she was going to put it on her windowsill. Clover said, "Next to what?" Nora looked at Dean, who was across the courtyard talking to the design consultant, who was laughing at something, and who looked up as if he had felt her looking. The way people did when they had been watching each other for long enough that the attention moved between them without needing a line of sight. Nora said, "Next to the person I was." Clover thought about this. She said, "Dad says buildings tell the truth." Nora said, "I know." She said, "And what does this building say?" Nora looked at the courtyard, at the threshold, at the chalk mark that had not been removed, that she had asked specifically not to be removed, that would stay on the doorframe until the building was changed again. She looked at Dean crossing the courtyard toward them, unhurried, in the June evening light. She looked at the drawing in her hand, the child's honest documentation of a door. She said, "It says that what was closed can open, that the walls you build to keep people out are the same walls you're living inside, and the correction is always simpler than you thought. Always already there in the structure, waiting. You just needed someone who read buildings the way other people read faces. Someone who crouched at the baseboard and found the small true thing and marked it with chalk and came back and kept reading. Someone honest about the cost of entry, who found, when they measured the frame, that the door was wide enough after all." There is a version of this story that calls what Dean did for Nora an act of rescue. He would tell you it wasn't. He would tell you he finished an audit and submitted a report and found a building that had been designed with good intentions and gotten some fundamental things wrong. The way most buildings did, the way most people did, the way he had done, in a different structure, in the years since Iris. He would tell you that Nora Callahan did not need rescuing. She needed someone to measure the doorframe without flinching at the measurement. She needed someone to bring the chalk back to the exact place where the difficulty was and mark it, and not pretend the mark meant the difficulty was gone. What she needed was not help. What she needed was a person who would read the truth of the building. Her building. The one she had designed wrong and spent 7 years moving through the difficulty of, and say, "This is what I see." Not to fix it for her, not to decide she couldn't fix it herself, to say, "Here, this is where the problem lives. Now you know." The one thing. Not a kind thing, not a soft thing, not a thing that offered to carry what she was carrying or pretended the weight was less than it was. Just the true thing, said plainly, by someone who knew the cost and came back anyway. 7 years of refusal, not because she was broken, because she had learned in the hardest possible way to read people accurately, and accurate reading had told her, over and over, that the help being offered was not about her. It was about the person offering it. Their discomfort with her limitation, their need to believe the limitation could be corrected, their certainty, well-meaning and absolutely wrong, that what she needed was to become again the person she had been before. Dean Marsh had never once tried to make her into the person she had been before. He had looked at the building she was, chalk in hand, and found every place where the design had stopped 1 degree short of honest use, and he had marked each one, and he had not apologized for finding them. That was what love looked like, when it came from someone who had read enough buildings to know the difference between what held and what just appeared to hold. It was quiet. It was technical. It was a chalk mark on a door frame in a building that was still being corrected. It was, for both of them, enough. Clover put 2 drawings on her bedroom wall that summer, one of the east courtyard, signed, and one of the front lobby threshold, with the chalk mark, which she had drawn from memory the day after the launch event and given to her father.